Okay, thank you everyone for joining our webinar, Leverage Fully Managed Archival Storage Capabilities Without Breaking the Bank. My name is Gerard Hiner. I'm the Chief Business Officer here at Webair. I'm joined today by my colleague and CTO, Sagi Brody. Today, during the webinar, we're going to be demystifying the options regarding archival storage, talking a little bit about tiered storage, archival backups, RTO, RPO, disaster recovery, glacier, latency, offsite backups, and more. And first, a little bit more about Webair and who we are. We're headquartered in New York for over 2 decades. We deliver secure, agile, and reliable managed cloud-based infrastructure solutions, leveraging our highly secure enterprise-grade network of global data centers. And as you can see, we have a global footprint, facilities around the world. We're headquartered in New York. We have several in North America, Europe, and Southeast Asia. We've also been recognized by Gartner and IDC, as you can see, the Gartner Magic Quadrant for Disaster Recovery as a Service, as a notable vendor, IT resiliency, managed hybrid cloud hosting, and more. And with that, I'm going to hand the platform over to Sagi Brody.
Thanks, Gerard. So the first thing we want to touch upon before we get really knee-deep into this new tiered backup architecture that we're going to talk about is to just make it clear that we are in fact talking specifically about the various use cases that fall under the realm of backups. On-site recovery, off-site recovery, long-term backups. And these are sort of requirements that are completely different than disaster recovery. It's important for everyone to understand that the platforms, strategies, infrastructure, software, and vendors that are used for backups and disaster recovery oftentimes are distinct and different. Sometimes they can be the same, but you have to have 2 separate conversations. And if there's overlap, great, but you're trying to accomplish 2 different goals. Today's webinar is focused on backups. We have others that we can share that are more disaster recovery focused. There are some specific use cases where there is some overlap. If you're replicating your data for disaster recovery, obviously you have a restore capability. So depending on your business requirements, you sometimes can achieve an overlap. And the business requirements is really where you need to start from before you can look for different solutions, compare different public clouds for backups. First, start with what you need and what you're trying to achieve. This is not just about putting in settings into your backup config of how many times you're going to run your jobs and what frequency. You really need to start with the business requirements. First and foremost, retention. How far back do you need to keep your data? And oftentimes this is a requirement which is mandated by your industry or vertical. It's healthcare, financial services, or legal. Sometimes there are legal requirements for your industry. If not, there are oftentimes industry best practices that will dictate what you should be doing. And many times your customers, your vendors, your partners are going to want to see that you're following the best practices. So how far back do you actually need to keep your data? And then second is how quickly do you need to be able to restore your data for sort of short-term backups and long-term backups. You need to identify those requirements. The next is how many actual copies of that data set do you need to keep? If you are mandated to keep 2 years or 7 years worth of backups, where is that going to live? If that entire data set is at one physical location, and if that location was to suffer some sort of unfortunate fate, you no longer can go back 2 years or 3 years and recover. Sure, you can get your backup infrastructure up and running, start running your jobs and be up and running again for new backups, but you've lost all your data. And so what is your appetite for risk? And do you feel the need that you want to keep all your long-term data at another location? And if you do, where do you want it to live? Should it be geographically diverse? Do you want it far away? And what are the ramifications if it's too far away? Do you need to keep all your data within a certain country or region or even state? And then lastly, what are your requirements around security encryption? And this is something that, again, would most likely come from industry-led certifications or best practices. So once you can kind of answer all these questions, you can kind of look at different platforms to help you figure out what strategy is best. As far as actual backup use cases, we've kind of pared it down to 2 use cases, and I think this is all pretty straightforward and people understand these things, but it's important for us to segment out the various use cases so we can come up with a better reference architecture for the future of backups utilizing hybrid cloud and public clouds. And so the first use case is speed-based backups, and more importantly, speed-based restores. In some cases, you want to perform a restore immediately in response to some sort of event like a ransomware or human errors or corruption. These might be events that where a disaster recovery solution might also be appropriate, but maybe this is a smaller type of event. A DR failover might be an overkill, or a restore would satisfy your recovery time objective. You don't necessarily need to use your DR. And so you're going to have a need to perform fast restores, immediate on-site without rehydration to recover for those types of events. So think speed. And then you're also going to have your retention-based backup requirements. These are going to be backups from your archive. You're pulling something from 3 years ago. These are backups that are not commonly required, not commonly read. They can be slow. And this is more about sort of cheap, long-term archival storage for legal hold or other similar use cases. So what we have are really sort of two opposing requirements. We have a fast, local, on-prem, immediate requirement, and we have a slow, long-term archival, which can be far away, but which I believe, and we believe, that you're going to want multiple copies of that archival data. You don't want it sitting at one spot. And so oftentimes, people will look at backups under the lens of one platform or one requirement. In reality, these two opposing use cases are counter to each other, and it would be better and more efficient and less expensive if you looked at them individually. If you're looking at one platform that can do both, oftentimes it might not be the best use case for each one, and the reality is it can get very expensive because the archival use case has a built-in accelerator. If you're mandated to keep data long-term, every month you're storing more and more data.
Now, Sagi, people tend to think of having one backup solution that can satisfy and cover all their bases. Is that even possible?
It's certainly possible. I think that to the extent that your organization is more complex and bigger, it's going to be more difficult. And to the extent that you have performance requirements and retention requirements, if you have one platform, you might find yourself tweaking the platform to make one of the use cases more efficient, and at the same time, it might be detrimental to your other use case concurrently. So first, let's talk about sort of local backups. Today, many enterprises have local on-premises backup storage in their offices or in a co-location, wherever their production infrastructure lives. They have the local backups, and this is sort of like the first line of defense. This is where the backups are landing. And we want to talk about sort of the issues with local backups, because local backups is a pain point that can be solved by these newer technologies and these newer backups as a service too. So I want to just bring light to the fact that there's like a false sense of security with local backup platforms. As you need to store more data, you're going to be finding yourself managing this local infrastructure, which can be very complex. And in my book, a good local backup platform would conform to 3 requirements. It would be resilient, meaning that a hardware failure locally would not cause your backups to fail and would not impede your ability to perform restores. So if you're running an appliance-based solution or even a clustered solution, which is actually going to stop working when you have a hardware failure, it's not a resilient platform. The next thing is it needs to be scale out. You need to be able to throw hardware or disk at the platform and just have it grow and not have to manage it individually. And again, there's a lot of false information. You have appliances which say they're scale out, but in reality, they're just scaling out their dedupe domain, or they're just spreading out the load. And there's only one copy of each of your files. And if you lose a node, you have data loss. And so you need it to be scale out in the truest sense of the term, where it's distributed and there's resiliency, where if you lose a disk or a box, You're not losing data, and you're not losing the functionality. And lastly, you do need a data reduction capability. Obviously, you want to save on data. You want to make use of dedupe and compression technologies. So surprisingly enough, there's not a lot of local on-premise backup storage targets that conform to all of these, or they can be very expensive. So you need to kind of look for that, and then also consider the pitfalls. Our backups might be running fine and within your backup window, no problem all day long, but do your backups slow down and bleed into your business operations if a restore is running concurrently, which leads to scheduling nightmares? Do your backups take longer, or can they even finish if you have to do a RAID rebuild? So really, consider the local backups and look at this webinar really as a way to kind of help alleviate those pain points. So traditionally, people have looked to the cloud to alleviate those pain points, and that's obviously what we're going to be talking about. But we also have to consider what are the pros and cons of the public cloud. Where does it make sense? Where doesn't it make sense? And how can we come up with a best of both worlds? So when people think of offsite backups in public cloud, they're thinking of AWS S3 or Glacier, Azure Blob or Google, cloud service providers, managed providers like Webair. And there's really kind of three strategies. One is, let's use the public cloud storage for archival backup. Let's use it for all of our backups and forget local. Or let's use it for that second copy. The first thing to kind of make light of, and nothing against AWS here, we'll actually be talking a lot about them, but is keep in mind that the public cloud storage is do-it-yourself platforms. It's all DIY. And if you choose to store your data on let's say a blob LRS platform, it clearly says on their site, this is one copy of your data on one local disk. And understand what the warranty is. If we lose your data, there's no SLA for that. The SLAs for these public cloud storage platforms are typically only network and availability based. And if the data was important enough to you that losing it would be a problem, then you would use one of their other tiers, maybe a globally replicated one, or maybe you would use 2 tiers. So I'm not saying that this is a bad thing. I'm just saying that understand what you're buying so that you don't have a false sense of hope or a bad expectation.
So wait a minute, Sagi. If I'm understanding you correctly, AWS doesn't protect you against data loss. So in the event that they lose a disk or a server, surely they must compensate you for that, right?
Yes, there's different tiers of storage, and some of them are more redundant than others. And if you were to lose data, then that's a risk that you're willing to take by buying the tier. And no, they will not compensate you for that. Because again, if it was important enough, you would have stored it at more than one place, and you had an assumed risk.
So it's the responsibility of the end user.
It's the responsibility of the end user, correct. And so really, on that note, again, just understand what you're buying and understand what you have an appetite to be accountable for and in charge of. Like if you're storing your data on S3, obviously we've been hearing a lot about these hacks where people's S3 buckets are publicly accessible and their data is leaking. And so, that's not AWS's fault, because in that sense, it's up to you to configure the bucket. You're responsible for that. It's like walking into Home Depot. You're buying all the components. You got to put it together yourself. So understand, the security aspect. Understand that not all vendors integrate with all the different tiers. Glacier, Deep Glacier, it's cheap and it's inexpensive, and it's a great platform depending on the use case, but it doesn't integrate directly with many backup software. S3 does, but Glacier doesn't. So don't just assume that. Also understand that if you're using a storage tier that is running on multiple availability zones, that just means multiple buildings on the same campus. It doesn't mean that you have multiple copies of your data geographically diverse. So understand what all the nuances of what you're buying are. And then there's many nuances and requirements related to latency and being close and far and bandwidth, which is what we're going to dive into in a minute here. And the last point I just want to say on this topic is that it's not a foregone conclusion that if you start using cloud storage for offsite backups, that it's going to be less expensive than buying hardware. It's actually the opposite. If you just start using cloud storage and you copy your backups there, and you don't spend any amount of time or not a good amount of time on looking at the right tier, copying it in an efficient way, picking the type of data to store on the different types of cloud tiers, you're actually going to spend more money over the course of 3 years on cloud than as you would have on local on-prem hardware. So if it's done wrong, the cloud's going to cost you a lot more than your on-premises gear, which is typically the opposite of why people go there in the first place.
So all of this seems to lead to an unpredictable pricing model or cost model. Are you saying that on-premise solutions are actually better than a cloud solution?
It can, well, I wouldn't say it's better because there's obviously the operational overhead and all that. But I guess what I'm saying is typically people just assume they go to the cloud and it's going to be cheaper, and that's absolutely not the case unless it's done the right way, which we'll talk about. So really, this all kind of comes down to, okay, it's sort of like they're the best of both worlds. We spoke about, how local on-premises hardware is going to be fast for restores, immediately available. I mean, that's obviously the right solution for that speed-based backup requirement. People obviously want to leverage cloud because it can be less expensive. It certainly is less expensive if it's done the right way. And then obviously to keep offsite copies of the data, make use of these inexpensive archive tier storage platforms, and to alleviate operational overhead and managing of equipment. So, is there a win-win, best of both worlds? And that's really what we're here to talk about today. So what we found works best is taking a tiered approach. It's really like a 3-tier architecture. And if you've heard about hybrid cloud, multi-cloud, or edge compute, what we advocate is all of that applied to the backup use case. And what we've been doing for our customers, and this is a reference architecture that is not specific to Webair. It's an architecture that you can build yourself. What we found is a tiered approach where we leverage cloud-based storage in the metro, not too far away, close to where the users are, to be a landing zone for backups. And we use that landing zone regional backup to send as much of our backups as possible. And we alleviate the need to keep backups on-prem. We reduce the local backup footprint as much as possible. Maybe we only keep one backup, and the rest of it goes to our metro landing zone. The metro landing zone is going to be close. It's going to be fast. It's going to give us that speed-based restore requirements, and at the same time, we don't have to manage that equipment. We don't have to run that tier. It's still cloud and OpEx based, where we can consume it as a service. And then behind that, behind the landing zone, we will tier the long-term archive data to an archive tier, a cheap and deep storage tier, which is transparent and just gets pulled through from directly to the user. And so by using this 3-tiered approach, we can keep multiple copies of our data in the cloud. We can reduce the on-premises footprint, and you don't have to even have the sort of on-premise connect directly to the cloud vendors. So the pros of this are really close, it looks and feels like it's on-prem. The restores are going to be much faster than traditional public cloud. We can get rid of our local on-prem equipment, and we can make use of an archive and keep multiple copies. And I'll get into further detail in a minute on this, what this actually entails and costs and looks like. The cons of this type of configuration, I mean, this is ideal. And again, you do get the best of both worlds. You're going to use that super cheap storage, and you get a fast restore, reduce on-prem headaches. It's not easy to set up, though. There's a lot of moving parts here. The data movers, the backup software that you're using, has to somehow support all this. And it's still not going to address all the costs, because you always have sort of this cost creep and sort of unknown costs when it comes to cloud. So what we've done is because this is sort of what we've been working on and actually built for many of our customers, is we operationalize this and turned it into a service. And so we sell this as a service. We provide our customers with one target for their backups, in the metro, in the region, close to them, low latency, and then we do the rest. From a single interface, they can restore from our regional locations, which are going to be fast. From the same interface, they can restore from the archive, and then we actually manage and monitor all this. So if there's any jobs that fail, we provide the backup software, typically Veeam. If there's any jobs that fail to us, we know immediately and we notify the user. If the user's local storage is getting close to being filled, we notify them. If backups haven't ran in a certain period of time. So it's managed and monitored 24/7. And so now here's a scenario where you can reduce the amount of storage that you have on-prem, you can reduce the operational overhead, and you can consume really backups as a service in its entirety and still make use of cheap and deep archival storage. And it's all backed by compliance and SLAs and legal liability.
So it seems to find that perfect balance between on-prem and cloud solutions.
It does, and we'll go through actual numbers now to kind of back it up. So it's not this sort of pie in the sky sort of idea. The other thing is that people tend to think, well, I can do that myself. That's why I have S3 and that's why I have Glacier. One's hot and one's cold. That's why I have my maybe GCP storage and my cold one. Why can't I just? That's why those tiers were invented. And it's true that those tiers are there, but when they say hot and cold, they're not talking about speed. They're talking about how often they're accessed and how quickly you can pull data back. When we talk about hot and cold, we're delineating between that speed-based requirement and archive-based requirement. And the reality is, most of the time you cannot use those public cloud platforms to really offset local backups or sort of like that nearline backup requirement because they're too far away. If we look here at this report that came out from Sodexis, the average latency from any user to the closest public cloud on average in the United States is anywhere from 50 to 70 or 80 milliseconds. So that's pretty bad. I mean, that really, yeah, you can use it for like an offsite archive, but to sort of replace your nearline recovery capability, it's not fast enough. Yes, if your office is around the corner from a cloud provider in Ashburn, Virginia, you're going to be much better. But these are averages. And if we look at the best speeds that are out there, as at best you'll get down, with Azure, at best you'll get down to 56 milliseconds. So what we've tried to do, and this is not something that we've done everywhere, but in many of the large metros in the United States and abroad, we've deployed backup infrastructure very close to our customers. In the New York City metro and Northeast, in the Los Angeles, California area, in Chicago, in Montreal, in London, in Paris, in Singapore. We have backup infrastructure deployed, which in some cases is under a millisecond to our customers. We're able to privately even connect this infrastructure to them so it looks like it's local. And once you have this tiered, this tiered layer, the speeds are almost as if they were on-prem. So in this slide here, we have an assumption of a 1 gig internet link, and we're doing a speed test, copying a 100 gig file up to a cloud, and we're using those average latencies. We're actually taking the best numbers from the last slide, and we're seeing how fast can we transfer data to the clouds. So you'll see here, to AWS, we're only getting 170 megabits per second on our 1 gig connection for a single stream copy, and Google and Azure are the same. But when your latency is anywhere from 2 to 15 milliseconds, I mean, there's no joke. We're certainly gonna smoke that. And our number, the 780 milliseconds, is based on a 15-minute latency, which is typically much worse than what we can achieve with our regional customers.
So just to clarify for myself and others on the webinar here, how is it that if I have a 1 gigabit internet connection, I'm only getting 171 megabits to AWS or 208 to Azure?
Well, because the throughput of data transfer is really based on two things. It's one based on the size of your pipe. That's how much capacity you have to send data. And the other is the latency, how far away and how long it takes data to go. And so can you run multiple backups at the same time on your gig, link, and saturated? Sure you can. But look at it from the opposite direction. Think how you can't do that for a restore. If you're trying to pull down one file, this limiting factor is going to limit you for restores, and also the amount of time it takes to copy singular data. So here's the actual speed. So for a 100 gig file, you're looking at anywhere from 63 minutes to 77 minutes. But with Webair's tiered configuration, with our tiered backup as a service, we'll get down to 17 minutes within that latency window. Now, and this is a 100 gig file. Compound this 10 times for a large important restore, it can be pretty bad. So again, people kind of have a false sense of security when they're sending their backups to the different cloud vendors. You have to understand, what is the latency, what is the speed, and all that. In fact, we can share tools with you after the webinar so that you can run these tests yourself to understand where do you fit in. Maybe you're much better, than the average in the country, but we can share some tools and some URLs so you can run these tests yourself.
Okay, so it's definitely possible for the end user to test that scenario.
Yeah, it should be tested prior to any sort of engagement or using anything. In Webair, we're more than happy to run these tests with you, as part of our conversations. So the next thing is there's obviously a lot of cost differences, and this is where we'll get into the meat and potatoes of all the numbers. So let's look at a hypothetical situation where we have a 500 terabyte data set. Maybe it's only 100 terabytes hot, which is typically, let's call that your 7 days, your 7 daily backups and 4 weeklies. So it's not a tremendous, data set size. Maybe we're looking at a 50 terabyte, infrastructure set. So 100 terabytes hot, which we would typically want to keep locally, but let's say, hey, let's move it to the sort of regional tier, and 400 terabytes cold. Maybe that's monthlies and a year's backup. So let's look at that. Maybe we're backing up 200 VMs. Let's assume we're going to pull back a very small amount of data every month. Maybe it's 5%. And we oftentimes find our customers, for compliance reasons, just doing this just to prove to the auditors that their stuff's even working. So I think it's a conservative number. Let's use Veeam software, enterprise software, as the data mover. And let's compare a customer buying the software themselves, perpetual, which is, for about 200 VMs, let's say it's $48,000, and let's say you're going to pay it off over 2 years, or the software provided by a provider like Webair. And so because we're using Veeam in this example, we're only going to use cloud platforms that are supported by them as a data mover. So we're not even going to look at Google because they're not even supported. And then let's also look at some of the operational overhead. And for that, and we're not going to assume that, but for that, let's say 20% of an employee's time who's making $80,000 a year to manage the backups. So when we look at the tiers here, we're looking at AWS, Azure, and Webair. So for the hot tier, we're using S3. For Azure, we're using Blob ZRS, which is keeping data on more than one box in one region. So it's not geographically diverse. And for Webair, it's our standard backup tier. For the cold storage, we're using S3IA, which is the coldest type of storage that Veeam will support. Veeam, like many other backup platforms, will not natively support Glacier. Yes, you can copy your data to Glacier. Yeah, you can manually do it, but you cannot re-ingest it using your same backup software the way that you typically are using S3.
So you need additional third-party tools to even help you do that.
If you want to use
possible.
If you want to use Glacier for your backups, you certainly can. But typical, like modern data tools, like you can cycle policy within AWS to orchestrate that. But if you want to get your data back, you're not going to do it from your backup and orchestration tool. It's going to be something manual or third-party tool. Okay. So to be fair, we're using natively supported platforms here, and that's why we're using Blob, Azure's cold storage as well. And for Webair, we're using our archive tier. So the first point to realize is with some of the public clouds, if you decide to delete anything on the cold tiers, you'll get penalized. AWS, 30 days. Azure, it's 180 days. Webair, we don't penalize. You'll notice, there's a cost difference, obviously, with Webair being the most expensive on the hot tier. But conversely, you notice that Webair, we're not charging anything at all to transfer data back. I also didn't include any operation fees because they're just too hard to quantify or to calculate in advance. AWS and Azure charge you per operations, but I couldn't tell you what that would cost, because I have no idea how many operations Veeam runs per job or how many jobs a day. It's not expensive, but it is relative. But so I'm not including it, but something to keep in mind and track. There's also support fees. I chose AWS's sort of midline $100 a month support fee. It can get a lot more expensive, $400 or $500. And Azure, this is their normal business tier, $1,000 a month. They come with the 1 hour response time SLA. We have 15 minutes. And most importantly, the other two don't have management monitoring baked in, meaning notifying the customer when the backups fail, notifying the customer when there's a problem, working with the customers to build the most efficient backup strategy, and all that. Obviously, the other two are just sort of DIY storage platforms. And lastly, they don't include sort of SLAs for the actual backup as a service. They do for the storage, and they're not including business associate agreements for the management and running of the backups. It's just for their physical data centers. So there's a lot more there. So if you look at it strictly just from a storage cost perspective, what we notice is that strictly from storage perspective and transfer, AWS and Webair are practically the same price. Now, Azure is a little bit less expensive. That comes in about $10,600. So it is less expensive just on the storage perspective. Now, if we add in the cost of the software, and we add in the cost of the operations, that 20% of a backup admin's time, what we notice is, Azure and Webair are now a wash, and AWS is a lot more expensive. So now we have Webair and Azure at the same price, but with Webair, you're getting all the management and monitoring and accountability and oversight built in. So you're getting a lot more for the same price. But this is all forgetting the fact that you can't use the public clouds to offset the local storage because of the latency that we spoke about. If you wanted to build this tiered architecture where you can get rid of some of your local storage, reduce your on-prem headache, and move back up to a local landing zone and then use an archive on the back end, you just simply can't do that with the public clouds because of where they're physically located. And so it's sort of like a moot conversation. Yes, we'll we'll match Azure's price all in, but you're still not going to be able to achieve those super low restore speeds anyway. So I feel like it kind of throws the whole pricing model out the window. So the last point I want to make is a lot of what we're talking about here just comes down to the entire industry maturing towards hybrid configuration models. No one's talking about public cloud anymore. They're talking about hybrid. They're understanding that there's always going to be some aspect that might be local. And everyone's going to this hybrid model using mid-tiers, using edge, and using different cloud platforms where they make sense. In fact, Webair, for our production workloads, that's what we advocate as well. We talk about keeping some stuff on-prem, private connectivity from a regional data center, mixing in co-location, private cloud, and many public clouds as well for cloud-native tools, SaaS platforms, and really mixing and matching all the infrastructures to different use cases as long as you have a reference architecture that can hit their touch points. That's all we're talking about. We're talking about hybrid cloud applied to the backup use case here. So really the last point on this is we touched a little bit about us providing management monitoring. And what does that really include? Well, we're going to be the ones that are going to help you integrate the data mover that we provide, and we're not just selling a specific type of backup software. You tell us what your platforms are and what your needs are, be it IBM platforms or x86 or physical servers, and we'll provide the software that we found to be the best for that use case. So we're a service provider. We're not here to sell one software over the other. So as your needs change and your platforms change, we'll just be a delivery vehicle instead of trying to push one or the other. So if you want us to work with HP or Dell, we're neutral. And really what we're providing is 24/7 monitoring and management. We're going to own security, encryption. We're going to own ensuring that your data is sovereign and complying with GDPR and ITAR and other regulations. And at the end of the day, you hold us accountable to an SLA, to a response time, and to an uptime guarantee. It's not how much bits and bytes am I storing. You can hold us accountable to performance. So you have to really ask yourself, who do you want to be accountable for the backups? Would you rather consume it as a service, or do you want to do it yourself by mixing in the infrastructure and public clouds yourself?
So can you share a real world example of someone that would use, the DIY or fully managed solution?
I mean, a good example to kind of look at this through is, let's say that you lost the backup. And let's say you had an employee running the backups, in charge of the backups. Maybe the employee is doing 50 other things, and
Right.
they've made a mistake, and someone goes to restore a backup and it's missing. Well, I mean, what's your recourse? Maybe you fire your employee or you reprimand them, but you still don't have your backup.
Mm-hmm.
And so, who would you like to be responsible for that? Is it ultimately going to be the employee, or would you rather have a contractual commitment from a provider who's going to take ownership of safeguarding it, and one that you can hold accountable to performance? A contract which has remedies if they don't perform, and has legal liability built in, and compliance. Which scenario would you rather be in? So, we have many customers who are very large enterprise organizations who have made the conscious decision that they don't want to be accountable or responsible. They have too many other things to worry about. On the other hand, if you have a huge IT team and they're savvy and they want to run it themselves, then there's obviously plenty of DIY tools if it's built the right way, like we spoke about. So with Webair's backup as a service, we provide everything that we spoke about, this tiered architecture built in, fully accountable. We only charge based on how much storage you're consuming. And we roll in everything that we spoke about. So all the complexities that we went over all get realized via, here's your price per gig. No operation fees, no management fees, no transfer fees, none of that. It all gets realized by how much data you're consuming. And if you don't already own the software that we recommend, then we'll provide it to you on a consumption model as well. Again, if it's VMware or Hyper-V or physical boxes, it's typically Veeam that we found to work best. Here's some screenshots of our portal where once you're backing up with us, you can see all the jobs, you can see historical usage, 24/7 support, and that's, I think, another good point is that you have people, you have an ecosystem. You can jump on a call. We'll look at your local backup configurations. We have perspective into what we've seen other customers do across verticals and industry. We've seen the good, the bad, the ugly. We can tell you why you don't want to send certain backups to NFS, why you shouldn't attach your backup servers to VMDKs. I mean, there's a ton of battle scars that we've went through that we use when we help our customers configure this, and ultimately us be responsible to manage it. We also take care of all the security and compliance. So on our platforms, we include SSA 18 SOC 2 Type 2, and we conform to HIPAA. We provide BAAs, Privacy Shield, GDPR, and many other regulations.
Yeah, so just going back a little bit, when I saw the BAA is mentioned, and so you said AWS, for example, they'll sign a BAA, but it's just for their data center, not the actual data in the data center.
That's right. The BAA point is one that people get wrong oftentimes. Typically the question people ask is, do you sign a BAA? That's actually not the right question. The question should be, what do your BAAs cover? And you're right, AWS and Azure and Google, their BAAs strictly cover the fact that if someone breaks into one of their data centers and steals a physical disk, then they're on the hook. But in their defense, that's all they can really be responsible for. Mm-hmm. Everything else is up to the user. You're the one who goes in and configures the security policies and the groups and the firewalls. And if your data is stolen, they had nothing to do with that. So of course their BAA shouldn't be responsible for that. For our managed backup as a service, we're taking full ownership and accountability. So our BAAs and our SLAs are right there along with that and match everything that we're doing. And here's just an example of one of the many backup as a services that we've engaged with. It was a publicly traded pharmaceutical company, 500 VMs, over a petabyte of data, and we were able to come up with that tiered architecture for them using multiple platforms where they could reduce their local storage footprint. Their administrators were able to not have to manage local storage as much. They had a in-region fast restore capability, but we were still able to provide them with that cheap and deep archival long-term storage. So they hit on all their best of both worlds. The last thing I wanted to throw in here is, like I said before, We're not talking about disaster recovery today, but they're not the same solution, but let's just say they're cousins and they go hand in hand. And so we obviously provide a ton when it comes to disaster recovery. And if you have any interest in that, we'd love to go over that with you and explain where there is overlap and how we can leverage network integrations for both, and sometimes similar platforms too. So that's really all we had today. So the big takeaway would be, think about what are some of the pain points that you'd like to outsource. Again, maybe you want to reduce your local backup footprint as much as possible. In some cases, we've helped customers totally get rid of all local storage completely, and we become the local backups. So think of even your local backups completely gone. We're taking that in the region, and then we're the ones who are going to archive it offsite out to the archive tier. So if that's something you want to jettison, and we can provide that as a service, as an OpEx-based model. But think about where your pain points are. Maybe you want to look at it from an application perspective. Which applications need 2 copies? Where are there holes in your resilience? What are the types of expertise that employees have related to this, where maybe there's not redundancy there with the expertise? So let us know what the pain points are, and we'll build a tiered architecture like we've shown you that can meet your price points, your costing models, or where you want to shift responsibility.
So it's really good that you shared an action plan like this. I mean, it's definitely a good basic starting point. I just have a couple of questions for you, Sagi. So early in the presentation, when you had the cost comparison on the screen, I noticed Azure and Webair were pretty much the same cost. Maybe you can go into more detail of why someone would use one over the other.
Well, I work for Webair, so I'm biased, but so they were the same price when we included the operational overhead, the 20% of an employee's time who makes $80,000 a year. That was an assumption that I made, and I don't think it's terribly bad.
But someone has to do that work.
Someone has to do that work, and I think that if it is the same price, I think if you're going to be paying the same amount, we all know that IT admins are overworked, right? You have all these new security requirements that are all getting put on their plate, and so they're already overworked, and things are getting overlooked. And guess what's the first thing that gets overlooked or ignored? It's the backups, because it's not production and it's not immediate, and so they typically fall by the wayside. So what's happening is the IT admins are overworked, and when it comes to backups and restores, they have to resort to IT heroics. It's one of those things where they're up all night, up all weekend. It gets done just in time. It barely worked. And IT heroics don't really help management realize that more resources need to be put into IT. It's actually very bad for IT. And so by outsourcing the backups, and it's dangerous, right? Because if the backup and the restore capability is one of the most important things you need. So I advocate to outsource that, because if it's going to end up costing the same price, and you're going to have a third party take accountability with legal liability and contractual reasons for it, why not do that? It just seems like a no-brainer. And typically the limiting factor before was, well, there's all this local backups, and the cloud is too expensive, the cloud's not fast enough. And hopefully with this presentation, we showed you, no, we can hit on the cost touch points, and we can hit on the local storage replacement touch point as well.
That's a great point. Thank you. So one more too I have for you on the tiered strategy. That sounds great. I could use a cloud service provider to minimize my local backup footprint and the costs and complexity that go along with that, without losing speed, right? At the same time, I can outsource the management and monitoring of my backups. Surely the public clouds want to do the same thing. I mean, what's preventing them from getting closer to the edge and doing that?
Yeah, so AWS and Azure, they have their primary regions. They have their main large deployments in the Ashburn, Virginias, and the Dallas area and wherever else.
That's all you hear is edge compute today, right?
Yeah, and so they are deploying closer to users. You do hear about them deploying edge, but keep in mind what they're deploying at the edge is not storage. They're deploying caching for their service delivery.
Okay.
They've actually decided that they're not gonna deploy in the edge in the region for these types of services the way that Webair is. What they've decided instead is, because they're not a company that's built to do these twosies everywhere. They're built for scale in these monolithic regions. So what they've done instead is they said, you know what? If our customers want our services in the metro, in their backyard, privately connected, well, we're going to give them our software and platform, and they can put it in their own data centers. So Azure has Azure Stack, which is Azure that runs on your own hardware. So if you're interested in this type of model with Microsoft, they're going to say, go install Azure Stack, and then you could use our platform in your data center. That obviously defeats the whole purpose of everything we spoke about today. So I don't think it's a good model. And AWS has Outpost. If you want AWS that's low latency, then you ask them to deploy Outpost in your data center, which again defeats the whole purpose. So you're never going to see them providing this edge compute or edge storage model, because they've already made a decision and they've already gone down a path of saying our solution for that is for the user to do it and deploy it in their own data centers on their own hardware. And so that's why it doesn't hold water. Whereas Webair, on the other hand, our interest is on providing our infrastructure low latency to our users in the regions that we're already deployed and the ones that we additionally deploy in. And the other thing that we're doing is we're leveraging network fabrics, so that if we are in the New York region, let's say, and you are as well, we can use software-defined interconnection so that you can, let's say you're co-located in a data center in New Jersey or Connecticut or New York. We can provide you with private connectivity to all of our platforms via a physical cross-connect and private connection. So it doesn't even have to traverse the internet. And so we make use of software-defined networking technologies that allow us to privately connect our infrastructure to your cabinet, to your cage, to your office without having to use the internet or ordering an expensive, old type of telco service. So we make use of like Equinix, ECX, Packet Fabric, Megaport, PCCWs, Console, and others, so that you can consume our services literally low latency and as if they were in your rack in your data center.
That's great. Thank you for clarifying. Okay, that's everything. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I want to remind everyone as well that as attendees of this webinar, you're each entitled to a free month of Webair services within 90 days of this webinar, which that date is actually December 17th, 2019. So please, if you have any questions or you want to take advantage of this, reach out to us. You can reach us via email at webinars@webair.com, or you can give us a call at 1-866-WEBAIR1. And that's 1-866-932-2471. Thank you again.